So this is our, maybe our first annual mission festival, we're not sure, but it is a mission festival, and we are pleased to have the Reverend Paul Cain with us. He is the pastor of Immanuel Lutheran Church in Sheridan, the headmaster of Martin Luther Grammar School and Immanuel Academy, the first vice president of the Wyoming district of the LCMS. He's on the board of regents for the upcoming Lutheran Classical College and works very closely with the CCLE and presumably has free time in the midst of all of those titles. Pastor Cain is going to speak to us this afternoon sort of as an introduction to classical education. If you don't know what it is, here's a chance to ask questions, to get to know more about it. So please join me in welcoming Pastor Cain.
Thank you. Well, howdy from Sheridan, everyone. It's a privilege to be back in our former circuit and for me to talk to you about the very Lutheran kind of education that we call classical education. I'd like to begin by comparing two quotations by people you've probably heard of. Martin Luther said, "Christians must be taught." It's actually one of the 95 Theses. And in Latin, it's the motto for one of our classical Lutheran high schools, the online Wittenberg Academy. But Aristotle once wrote, "Some people cannot be taught." He was saying that about his life experience and the people that he had to deal with. It just so happens to match our experience with people today as well. What do we do with both of those quotations when we try to put them together and figure out a thing or two about young people and education? Here's my idea for today. Christians should teach Christian things to other Christians. And that is a pretty radical thought in America today. Christians should teach other Christians Christian things, plus our heritage of Western civilization that helps us understand all of the allusions that we hear in Shakespeare and all of the Shakespeare references we hear in popular culture. Let's form a very basic definition of what classical Lutheran education is. And I'm going to borrow from our friend, Dr. Jean Edward Veith. The liberal arts can equip a child for effective service in the world. Catechesis, teaching in the faith, can equip a child for everlasting life. Classical Lutheran education can be defined with those classical liberal arts, there are 7, with Lutheran catechesis, both of them together at the same time. The liberal arts cultivate the student's mind and character with academic rigor, tools for learning, and formative content. Lutheran catechesis instructs and nurtures matters of the soul through the Holy Scriptures, the Lutheran confessions, and the liturgy and hymnody of the Church. With the 7 liberal arts, the 3 sciences, moral, natural, and theological, and the small catechism's 6 chief parts, classical Lutheran education prepares servant leaders for church and world. That does get a little bit in the weeds. So let me tell you a little bit about my school, Martin Luther Grammar School in Sheridan. We're a classical Lutheran school that was founded in 2003, so it's relatively new. But it is not the first school in the history of Immanuel Lutheran Church in Sheridan. We had one 100 years ago in German on the 2nd floor of the parsonage, and it was illegal because they taught in German. Not unlike the Supreme Court case Meyer versus Nebraska, where one of our LCMS male school teachers was arrested in Nebraska for teaching the faith in German. Went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Missouri Synod won one of its very first Supreme Court cases. There have been many others since. Martin Luther Grammar School has always been modest in size. There have been years with 14 students in 2 classrooms with 2 teachers, or 28 students. We've had varied gender comparisons between male and female as God created them. One year when we had 22 students, 15 of them were boys. Another year with 24 students, 1 was a boy. I know the guy. He's working as a farmhand now, as a grown-up. He had a very interesting learning experience, and he opened a lot of doors. And because of his education, a lot of doors were opened for him. We still have 2 teachers, and we're anticipating somewhere between 20 and 30 students for fall. A lot of parents don't make up their minds of which system they're going to go with until about August. Mrs. Russell has been with us since 2003. She's a real trooper, and she gets all of the new young ones, kindergarten, 1st, and 2nd grade. There's a picture of her on the slideshow that we can look at over after the presentation. Pastor Rene Gonzalo Castellero has been our 2nd teacher now for 4 years. He is an ordained pastor. He is our associate pastor at Immanuel Lutheran, but his day job during the school year is taking care of 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. What does the school day look like? Well, we have chapel every single day. On Friday, it's the last thing, but the other days, it's first thing. And the morning looks like this: Jesus, letters, and numbers. We go to chapel, we do our math, and we do our language arts with Latin integrated into the teaching of English. If you think that's intimidating, imagine being the headmaster of the school, and it's sometimes fun to struggle to keep up with the Latin skills of 5th graders. Afternoon is a little different every day. We have all of the other important subjects too. Geography gets woven into history, and we often pick literature titles from the history time that we're studying. The art sometimes follows along with history. We had some tinfoil projects when we read Johnny Tremaine and learned about the Revolutionary War. So the art followed the history. When we studied the Alamo on our Veritas Press history cards, we made time to watch a certain movie version of it with John Wayne. The students learned who John Wayne was. When we studied the Battle of the Little Bighorn, we could drive just an hour to the north and do a joint field trip with our sister school, Mount Olive in Billings. It worked out rather well. We teach science. We have extra Bible reading as part of our religion classes. I'll tell you more about chapel as we go on. And the day ends with prayer, with a piano right there in the classroom. My history with classical education really dates back to the same time that the school was founded in 2003. At the time, I was pastor at Immanuel Green River, and I was covering a vacancy in Rock Springs in addition. The Board of Elders encouraged me to go to that Lutheran Education conference they're having on the campus of UW. We'll send you, and then maybe you can bring back some things that can help our preschool. It was the 5th conference of the Consortium for Classical Lutheran Education, and it changed my life. It was my educational conversion, if you will. I always felt that something was missing from my high school experience in my small town in Nebraska. I thought something was different as they were de-emphasizing Western Civ at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I could use one course, the history of pre-modern Japan, independent study, to cover 15 hours of credits under the new program. I could double major in math and history with a minor in Asian studies and graduate in 4 years. Now, I didn't know I was going to the seminary immediately after that. Otherwise, I probably should have been a classics major with a music minor. That would have been more practical. But being a headmaster who has the double major in history and math, makes it really easy to come into the classroom and sub, either for the little ones or for Pastor Castellero's upper grades. In 2003, I changed my pastor documents to say, I want to be part of a Lutheran congregation someday that has a classical Lutheran school. I took home one of the classical publishers' catalogs and began using my continuing ed to buy up the books and read them and re-educate myself, because I didn't have the blessing of a Concordia program with even a classical ed minor option. We were praying for that day, and I'm so thankful that that's happened too. Fast forward a little bit, Green River High School had a very active release time for the Latter-day Saints students. A lot of communities have that. And for a time when they had the new high school, but the old seminary building, LDS seminary, not LCMS seminary, they used the school buses to take them over there. We were able at Immanuel Green River to get Lutheran release time approved through the school board. We were very excited, and our parents in the class, in the congregation, wanted us to back off a little bit while they tested out that block scheduling. Teachers know how block scheduling is different from some of the shorter classes during the day. By the time that year had elapsed, I'd taken a call to Morrill, Nebraska, still in the Wyoming district, the Wyoming panhandle, if you will. And we kept reading, we kept studying. And then out of the blue, I received the call to Immanuel Sheridan. And it's been a very blessed 12 plus years there. That's a little bit of our school's history and a little bit of mine. One of my habits when doing a presentation like this is to make it more relevant to what you want to know. I can talk, I'm a pastor, you know this, we can go on and on, but I want it to be interesting to you and answer some of your questions. So I've got a blank card ready and my pen ready. I'd like to hear some of your questions now instead of just at the end, though we'll have some questions at the end. And I'll work the answers, my answers to your questions into the presentation as we go. How about that? Any questions so far? Yes, please.
You just go kindergarten through 5th grade, you said?
That is correct. We currently do K through 5, and I can share more about how we handle other things.
So you track those kids when they go to public school in 6th grade, or how's
We
that?
do. We certainly do. That's a great question. I'll answer more. I'll expand that part of the presentation. Yes, please.
You said there are 7 liberal arts. What are all 7?
Ah, yes. We also need to address the word liberal, don't we? Yep. Okay. Other questions? Please.
Let's talk about accusations of classical education being elitist, or only for upper class people, or only for rich white people, or all of these things that sort of get lost.
Yep, we do need to talk about that, don't we? Yeah, okay, thank you.
I can learn about that also. Are there any options for special education within the classroom?
Great. Other questions? Yes.
Do you have requirements with the state and or other?
All right, thank you for those. That helps me out a lot. Hopefully, our conversation will generate more, and we can deal with some other Q&A at the very end. One of the things I learned about being part of different circuits throughout the Wyoming district in my 20 years as a pastor is there's a lot of history that doesn't always get remembered. Now, with St. John's Lovell, you recently had your centennial, and that's one of the most creative uses of Lutheran Worship 1982 I've ever seen. There was also a target practice that we were wondering how many hymnals it would take to stop a 9mm, but that's a story for another day. St. John's, I am told, in the Little White Church days, had a school. St. John's Lovell already had a Lutheran school. But according to the story, the version that I was told, it had to close. Not because of lack of interest or lack of money or lack of students, which is a very real thing, that latter part, but because the teacher was drafted. This happened because the Deutsche Evangelische Lutherische Synod von Missouri, Ohio und anderen Staaten, and since I spoke in a tongue, I need to interpret my tongue, the German Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states, including Wyoming, we had a primarily male teacher corps. And because they were not ordained pastors, they were draftable. During World War II, based on the experiences of our largely male teachers in World War I, some, like pastors, made requests not to be drafted, but stay home, like some of the farmers were considered essential workers during World War II, like my maternal grandfather. Some of those requests were granted. Others were not. It seems to become a very different question by the late 1960s, but again, that's getting a little in the weeds. What happened after the war is this status was formalized with what would become the Department of Defense and the Internal Revenue Service. So this is why Missouri Synod pastors aren't just called minister of religion with the IRS. The Missouri Synod classifies them as ministers of religion ordained, and the teachers, both male and female, are considered ministers of religion commissioned. So it's your congregational history and world history with World War II and Synod's history and negotiation with the federal government all just come together in a rather fascinating way. I'd love to hear more about the history of your school. The history of our school in the 1920s in Sheridan included a request to the mission board of the Northern Nebraska District. They had Nebraska North and Nebraska South. Immanuel Green River was founded by Nebraska South in 1965. Now we're all in the same Wyoming district, based on rail lines, and now cars make a whole lot more sense for us. Our request for money for a school building to be built next to the church and next to the parsonage was declined, and also by the district convention. So, yeah, I'd love to hear more about the history of Wyoming Lutheran schools. Our current setup is kindergarten through 5th grade, and it works out very nicely, 2 classrooms, 3 grades each, but we also need to pay attention to how many levels within each grade. You can just teach 2nd graders and have 3 different levels of reading, 3 different levels of math. But if you have multiple grades in the same classroom, then the advanced 1st graders can hang out with maybe the struggling at grade level 2nd graders. And maybe you've got a 1st grader who comes to your school after kindergarten and public school, and she just takes to classical Lutheran education like a duck to water, and not only finishes 1st grade, but 2nd grade by the end of her 1st year at Martin Luther Grammar School. Absolutely amazing. I hadn't seen anything quite like that since my 1st year, where we had a young man came to us. He was doing special ed. He was 3 years behind. He spent 2 years with us, and he caught up. After 5th grade, he and his parents wanted him with his age peers in 6th grade, in 7th grade, and he was immediately behind again. But the parents get to decide what they want to do for their child. Largely what we've noticed is the students who've had the full program, kindergarten through 5th grade, when we haven't had occasional 6th or 6th, 7th, and 8th, they end up getting placed in the public school, junior high, in some advanced courses with 7th graders and 8th graders. That seems to be normal for us. Others choose anything from St. Paul's Residential High School in Concordia, Missouri, or Wittenberg Academy. That's becoming a more popular choice with our members who attend our school as well. But they do very well, especially in the public system. The parents and the grandmothers note that when they're talking with family and their peers who have had a classical education, they speak one dialect. But when they're talking with their age peers in the public system, they switch over to a different cultural speaking vocabulary. And it's a fascinating thing to watch. So we do track them. It's not formal, but we should probably make that a little more formalized. It really looks very good on paper, what we do know about. So the 7 liberal arts, let's talk about those. You have the trivium, hopefully you hear tri, like tricycle and triangle, and the quadrivium. We have to get used to in the synod to a quadrennium, a 4-year cycle. So there are 7 liberal arts. Liberal derives from the Latin word for free. So I've experimented with different terminology. Instead of the liberal arts, how about the arts of freedom? Our new school start in Jonesboro, Arkansas has proposed this language, the liberating arts. These are the education things, both content and teaching techniques, pedagogy, that the ancient Greeks and Romans used for their children to train them up to be citizens, but they used a more outcome-based education, my interpretation of their concept, with their employees or slaves, because they did have slaves. They wanted the slaves to be able to work, to contribute to the household, but they wanted their children to be able to think and reason for themselves, because they were going to be the leaders and the property owners. So the trivium consists of the arts of language. You've got grammar, you've got logic or dialectic, and rhetoric. We use these words in classical Lutheran education differently than the secular world, right? We're not going to talk about empty rhetoric out of DC or of City Hall or out of Cheyenne. We're going to use rhetoric a little bit differently than that. Grammar includes learning letters and reading and spelling. This is where you throw in penmanship. Grammar can also be understood as a stage in human development, in child development. This is the understanding that you hear from an essay that I love by Dorothy Sayers called The Lost Tools of Learning. You can get it free online, or you can get it in the back of a book called Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. Parts of this are out of date, and it's a bit Calvinist. CCLE is looking at doing an annotated version from a Lutheran point of view of this essay. The essay is important. She goes through grammar, logic, and rhetoric as developmental levels, but then she says something where she's been proven wrong. Allow me to read a little bit. I propose to deal with the subject of teaching, properly so called. It is in the highest degree improbable that the reforms I propose will ever be carried into effect. Well, thank God she's wrong. Christians in Moscow, Idaho kind of rebooted education in a classical way, and Lutherans have too with the Consortium for Classical Lutheran Education. So grammar is the first. You can also see a grammar to teaching math. You have to have all of the Arabic numerals. You have the pluses and the takeaways and the divide and the times and the Pac-Mans, right? The greater lands and the less thans. All of the other symbology, so you can teach the kids how to count, all of their fact families and all of that fun stuff from math. There's also a grammar to the faith. the 6 chief parts. And Dr. Tallman has a beautiful description of how grammar, logic, and rhetoric are found in Luther's Small Catechism. So logic is the analysis of language. So this is the second of the liberating arts. Analytical thinking, discernment, argumentation. So, debate. We begin to get there. We need some of the tools of rhetoric. There's formal and informal rhetoric, and we end up putting something together called a syllogism. A syllogism, it's a Greek word. I'm sorry to scare you with a Greek word not found in the New Testament. If A, then B. If B, then C. Therefore, if A, then C. See, you know how to do this, especially if you've had some geometry and you've worked on proofs. We still have some of the fumes of this stuff in our common experience, but it's not as rigorous as we would provide in a classical Lutheran classroom. Logic helps to organize a student's mind and disprove an invalid syllogism that I'm going to propose to you. Okay, that A, B, B, C, A, C thing that we just did. There are 256 different ways to arrange that. Okay, just deep breath. It's more math, sorry. But only 24 of them are legit, valid. The rest of them, I think, are used by politicians and people promoting evolution and global warming, but that's just my hobby horse. They're very rhetorically effective to convince people of things, but they have to be valid before they're true. So let's look at an invalid syllogism, okay? Cold, wet rice is better than nothing. Okay, think about mission work, think about human care. Nothing is better than a good Wyoming steak. Is this a valid syllogism? Cold, wet rice is better than nothing. Nothing is better than a good Wyoming steak. Therefore, cold, wet rice is better than a good Wyoming steak? You know that's not true. And besides, we're going to have a baked potato from an air fryer, because they do it better, with all of the trimmings and a nice medium Wyoming steak. We know that's not right, but why is it not right? Nothing is used in 2 different ways. It is not a common term. It is not a valid B. So it is an invalid syllogism and isn't true. So we're back to knowing that steak is better than cold, wet rice. So that's logic. Rhetoric focuses on eloquence, beauty, and persuasion with language. One of my most fun reading things that I've done recently was a book on hostage negotiation techniques applied to daily life. They work. Well, why do they work? He's repurposing classical rhetoric, persuasion, for crisis communications. So I had to identify all of those things. Rhetoric allows the student to read and write with eloquence, and there's a lot of modeling with that. So the other 4, the quadrivium, are things that are a little more familiar to you, honestly. After you've mastered the first 3, then we move on to the other 4, and they're the arts of mathematics. Arithmetic is the theory of number. Then we end up with music theory, where we have number in time. Geometry is number in space, and astronomy is number in space and time. And all of it fits together. That's the liberal arts. So is this elitist? Well, sometimes it's thought so because tuition is involved, but there are often efforts in the various states, just like in Wyoming a couple of times, to do school choice. It doesn't have to be elitist. Our tuition in Sheridan is designed to be very, very affordable. Our congregation sees the school as our mission outreach to the community. We took part of what we were sending to district, that district sent on to synod, and we kept it at home so that we could provide an education. Half of the cost is covered by the parents in tuition, half is covered by the congregation and donors within the congregation. That's how we floated. All 5 Wyoming district grammar schools run their railroads just a little bit differently, but it's the same budget once you compare apples to apples. It doesn't have to be elitist, and for that I want to quote someone who endorsed Lutheran Classical College during my presentation tonight. In the meantime, she wants to have a plumber who can read Latin because she knows she'll have an educated, well-rounded person that knows more than just one narrow of specialization. Someone who can appreciate a pastor who preaches from the original Greek and the Hebrew manuscripts. And it's just a fascinating thing that we have there. When it comes to special ed, one of the CCLE board members who was elected the same time I was, Cheryl Swope, has a book through Memorial Press called Simply Classical. She and her husband adopted a boy and a girl with special needs, and they applied the pedagogy, the teaching techniques of classical ed and the content to this boy and this girl that so many other people had literally given up on. Her daughter is a poet, and her son volunteers to run the county museum. They are well-rounded, educated, productive members of society and pious Lutherans. It is a wonderful success story. There are other similar success stories. I could tell you about one of our students who was curled up in a fetal ball when he first came to us, and by the end of his time at Martin Luther Grammar School, he attended the joint invitational speech meet in Billings at the big gym that Trinity has on the west side of Billings, and he gave a speech in front of an entire gym of 3 schools worth of students. It was absolutely humbling. What are our requirements with the state? Well, there are some things that we have to do for health and safety, which the health things, there's an extra layer of complication with health officers of the state and the county, but we have a remarkable amount of freedom as a parochial school, a religious school, and a private school. What we have endeavored to do is to meet or exceed, most of the time exceed, the state standards for academics, for contact hours with teachers in the classroom. We expect our all-day kindergartners to be there from 8 to 3:30, and they can do it. It takes a little bit of training and some extra, graham crackers and milk chocolate. We got to have those too, Some recess time, but they learn how to behave in chapel, and it's been an enormous blessing. We've got a whole section of our How to Run the School 6-binder system that I had to write over the years on here's what Wyoming code says, here's how we do that. And just in my email since I began talking, I got one of our teachers' schedules and supply lists. So we're almost ready to copy those off and drop them off at Walmart. Let me tell you a little bit about chapel, and then I want to take some questions. We want to give the children a very well-rounded Christian catechesis. Only about half of our students, max, come from our congregation. We have Catholics, we have Baptists, we have folks with very little Christian background. Mondays, we do the Old Testament lesson of the week and we pray matins. Tuesdays, it's responsive prayer to allow for more time on the epistle lesson of the week and the psalm. We have a hymn that we sing all through the week that they learn and almost memorize. Wednesday is the day we do morning prayer, though we may substitute that for matins in Latin from this Lutheran hymnal designed for schools like us. Thursday, Pastor Castellero leads the service of prayer and preaching, and the sermon text is their catechism memory work for the week. And then on Fridays, end of the school day, they get to enjoy that big, tall candle, light the candles from it, sing evening prayer, and it's an occasional sermon, usually on honor your father and mother. We're sending you home to them right now. All right, additional questions or follow-ups, please? Sir?
You don't get any money from the state. It's all private.
We do not get any money from the state, but I can qualify that. I know of some classical Lutheran schools that applied for and received one of the payroll protection loans. Given the requirements, we were able in some cases, just to speak on behalf of those schools, able to meet those requirements very easily, and we did not believe there were any conscience strings. Now, some of those schools are saying, had the Equality Act been before the current Congress back then, we never would have touched that with a 10-foot pole. We were offered, as a private school in town, some gloves, some masks, some hand sanitizer, and some of the thermometers that you could aim right at the forearm instead of the forehead. I have a problem aiming a thermometer at a kid's forehead for some reason. And everything that we had not opened, we had to return because there was a court case at the federal level. That was rather awkward, and the local school district was embarrassed. We do receive, because our parents pay taxes, we do receive special ed if necessary, occupational therapy, speech therapy, physical therapy. That is possible. To date, we've only received speech therapy. We do have a volunteer in the Adopt a Grandparent program, the nice people with the red vests, that is funded through some federal money, but administered in the state of Wyoming. We provide her lunches, and that's our obligation to her. But otherwise, it's donations from the congregation, members, parent tuition, surprise gifts, and occasional grants that I get to write up. Yeah, please.
How do you guys do lunches?
Great question. We have a hot lunch and pizza about once a month, but most of the time our kids bring lunches with them. The elders help the youngers microwave anything that needs heated up before they microwave their own meals. Pro tip, put every microwave on a different circuit in the old church basement kitchen. Just save yourself some sanctification tests. So occasionally there's a hot meal, but largely they bring their own. Yeah. We do have a staff member we call the school monitor. He or she supervises the children at recess on our own playground or during lunchtime, and sometimes helps with library. We've had both men and women. Thanks be to God, we had the right man apply. Before that year, we had 15 boys out of 22 students. And he would be there with his beard and a different style of cowboy hat every day, watching the herd. And it worked out great. Yeah. Any other questions? Please.
How have you found parents adjust to it? Because I'm just thinking of probably 99% of people, I'll talk about myself. I was, K through 12 public school, community college, state university. And I can say, classical ed sounds great. I want to send my kid there, and then the kid comes home and says, Dad, can you help me with my Latin, my rhetoric, my logic? And I say, no. How have parents adjusted, or has Immanuel or Martin Luther been able to have some sort of supplemental education, or
Right.
what we're doing?
We do some supplemental education, but largely it's the children correcting their parents' English and Latin pronunciation. We get phone calls. I'm the guitar teacher. I'm the public speaking teacher. Age-appropriate logic and rhetoric. we field phone calls just like every other teacher, and sometimes the parents are panicked. What we've noticed is kids that are making a transition from another place or another system, whether a private school or a public school, they usually do fine after the first 2-3 weeks, which is why we have our fall parent-teacher conference the beginning of October. So the same week as pastor and teacher conference in the Wyoming district. Thursday, Friday, we have those to help the parents figure out, and then we want to honor the parents as the child's teachers and be on their team. So they always opt into stuff and never have to opt out of things with us. And if we need to adjust because their daughter is reading 5th grade books as a 2nd grader but hasn't had Latin in her life, we have the grade student-teacher ratio to be able to have time to do that during the school day. But honestly, the folks who have the hardest time transitioning are the parents, and it takes a good 2 months to do it. One of our success stories was that 1st grader who's completed 2nd grade already, right? Because she's from another nearby town, we sometimes hosted her overnight, my wife and I. That meant I got to help with homework, and I got to fill out the parent sign-in sheet and check things off and do the little parent initials. And it's a very different experience as the headmaster, running things, helping with homework, substituting, leading chapel, all of these varied things. And her parents figured out, you have enough time during the school day to get your homework done. So why have you been messing around during the school day, during your free time, and still have homework to do? Once they figured that out and got her in the groove, it worked out great. But still, yeah, there are occasional phone calls home. Our German Lutherans really had a passion for education. One of the hidden things was the Saxons. We know that the Saxons didn't want to have happen to them religiously what had happened over in Prussia with the Union churches between the Calvinists and the Lutherans, which watered down Lutheran doctrine and virtually eliminated Lutheran practice. So the story we've been told from Missouri Synod history is that they came to avoid religious persecution. And they're not totally wrong. Another factor was the pastor with charisma. Note I didn't say charismatic pastor, that means something different now. At Dresden that led the migration over here and eventually to Perry County and St. Louis, hence Missouri Synod. But what Thomas Korczak brings up in his book Lutheran Education, this would be a great addition to a church library or your library, is he points out a couple of interesting things. One was the schools were undermining what parents were teaching at home. And the schools were undermining what pastors were teaching in catechism class and in their sermons. So they took the very radical step of leaving the country. I wonder sometimes when history will repeat itself. We don't really yet have the opportunity for the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Mars or the moon. You know, we can keep the M in Missouri. But I do pray for opportunities for us to be faithful, as Pastor preached about in his sermon today, that if our hand or our eye causes us to sin, that anything that hinders our relationship with Christ and receipt of the means of grace, we should cut off. And that might be very, very difficult for us. So I make it a point, as he did in the collect today, to pray for all of our educators. My sister is a public school teacher, but she is asking her pastor and her brother questions about the new health education standards that sound a little bit like a Brave New World in what they're asking the children to experiment with. One of the other fascinating things about this book is in 1847, at the foundation of Synod, there were 16 congregations and 14 schools. That's a part of our hidden history. 25 years later, 499 congregations and 472 schools with an enrollment of 30,000 students. 209 teaching pastors and 263 teachers, and at that point they were mostly male. They were. Sometimes 2 or more congregations belong to the same parish, like we have dual parishes today. But in 1872, there were 18 more LCMS schools and congregations, and 113 more LCMS schools than LCMS congregations in 1897. Wouldn't that be a wonderful problem to have? I thank you for your questions. Pastor.
Join me in thanking Pastor